Greetings, dear viewers. It is I, Drahjan, and welcome back to another homebrew video. Now, I'm not exactly an expert on making homebrew, but I do dabble. As you can tell with my last two homebrewy videos, where I turn Pathfinder creatures into creatures for Dungeons & Dragons. Today we're taking a look at siege mechanics. The town of Greenest in the Horde of the Dragon Queen is one of the best examples of how to run a siege-like scenario for Dungeon Masters and players alike. But it doesn't cover everything. What about the keep itself? What's its AC? What's its health? What if my players wanted to kick down a door, for example? Or smash that obviously innocent chest? What then? Well, the Dungeon Master's Guide actually has a set of rules to help with such things. If we turn to page 246 and 247 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, we actually get this little chart. Now, I actually had to get this off of the internet. This is not as it's seen in the book exactly, but it is the same concept. We have ACs and hit points for inanimate objects. The AC is for what material it's made out of, and its hit points is based on its size and how well it's made. If it's fragile or if it's resilient. This actually makes it easy to keep track, there we go, that's what I was looking for, keep track of stats for non-monster objects, such as a rug instead of the smothering rug, or maybe just a regular tapestry, maybe even a chest that isn't a mimic. You can keep track of it very easily by using this system. However, there is, of course, this option down here for huge and gargantuan objects. It says the DM's option, but I'm going to go ahead and give you some estimations. For huge, like a castle gate or a segment of a castle's wall, I would say at fragile 2d20 and resilient for 10d20. Now, a gargantuan object such as a house or a similar sized building could be a set hit points. 150 for a fragile house, like say it is made out of straw. Or a 300 hit point house for a well-fortified building. Or whatever gargantuan structure. Now, there is another option that it gives you. For something like a gigantic statue, it explains that if you were to attack its leg, for example, you can set that leg as a medium-sized object. And once that object hit 0 hit points, it would be destroyed. Which would cause, of course, the statue to fall. Now, what if we wanted the object to last longer? Like, say we have a wall, and, well, we don't want it to get destroyed so easily or so quickly. That is where the damage threshold comes in, back over on page 246 and 247. Quote, big objects such as big objects such as castle walls often have extra resilience represented by a damage threshold. An object with a damage threshold has immunity to all damage it takes. An amount of damage from a single attack or effect equal to or greater. Unless it takes that amount of damage for a single attack or effect equal or greater to the damage threshold, in which case it takes damage as normal. So if you have a damage threshold of 15, your players would have to make an attack that is equal to or greater than 15 points of damage in order to deal damage to the object. Otherwise, no damage is dealt to the object. So how exactly would we be able to calculate that damage threshold? Well, I did come up with a small system for that, and here is the math I used behind it. Or for this example, we're using a level 20 barbarian. It gives +4 to damage rolls while it's raging, and has a proficiency bonus of +6. And a great sword has an average damage of 7 damage, with no modifiers. So you have an average damage total of 17 slashing damage without being a critical hit. This is not counting any additional effects, such as a smite or a sneak attack. So using this example, we can calculate that a huge object would have a damage threshold of 15 roughly, while a gargantuan object would have a damage threshold of 20. Okay, so here's an example of the damage threshold. We're going to have our gargantuan object, a house, with a damage threshold of 200 HP. An earth elemental has the siege monster ability, which causes all of its damage to be multiplied by 2 to objects and structures. Its slam attack is 14 damage, but thanks to siege monster, when it deals damage to the house, it'll be 28 damage, which surpasses the damage threshold. So it can deal damage to this house. Now, the reason why I have its HP at 20 is because while most of the house is made out of stone, the roof is most likely of lesser material. So it would be slightly less resilient, but not exactly fragile. Okay, so next question you are going to propose is, what if we want to make things a little more difficult or lessen the difficulty? I'm going to quote the book again. Objects are immune to poison and psychic damage. You might decide that some damage types are more effective against a particular object or substance than others. Now, it gives an example of taking a pickaxe after a stone wall. But here's my example. We're going to use a tapestry. Its AC will be 11 because of the material it's made out of. HP is going to be 27, since it's a decent-sized object. It would be vulnerable to slashing, fire, and lightning damage, but immune to bludgeoning, poison, psychic damage, and it would be resistant to cold damage. So giving your structure more immunities or even resistances could increase its difficulty, but giving it vulnerabilities would make it easier to destroy. And just a reminder, vulnerability means you multiply the damage by 2. Resistant, you cut the damage in half. And immunity, nothing happens to it at all. For example, the Instant Fortress, which is a magic item, actually gives us damage immunities right off the bat. It is immune to all non-magical weapons except for siege weapons, and it has resistances to all other damage. And it actually segments each part of the structure into different hit point values: the walls, the roof, and a door, each one having 100 hit points. And the AC for the whole thing, since it's made out of adamantine, is 23. Now, speaking of siege weapons, we'll go ahead and go into there because those help with causing sieges. The Dungeon Master's Guide on page 255 is where we can actually find the siege equipment. And we actually have one that is prominently shown in Hoard of the Dragon Queen. And that is the Ram. It's a large object with an AC of 15 and 100 hit points. Damage immunity to poison and psychic. And it provides half cover against attacks from above to the 4 or more creatures that are operating it. And it has its own special attack, which is operated by the 4 creatures, which is a ram attack. +8 to hit, reach of 5, 1 object, and it deals 16 or 3d10 bludgeoning damage. Alright, so that is for when you are attacking, or when your players are trying to lay waste to a castle, to try a siege. But what about defending a keep or a stronghold? What can your players do to defend against a siege? Well, there are other siege equipment listed in a Dungeon Master's Guide. One being the Ballista, which, honestly, I don't know why it's not in Hoard of the Dragon Queen. It would make the most sense since you have to fight a dragon. Spoilers. And the Suspended Cauldron would also be quite useful against the cult of dragons that are attacking Greenest. So I don't know why neither of these are in it. The Ballista will be dealing 16 piercing damage, and excuse me, hold on one second. Sorry, my throat was dry. Anyways, the Ballista takes an action to load, 1 action to aim, and 1 action to fire. The Suspended Cauldron takes 3 actions to fill a cauldron, and 1 to tip it. So these are not easy things to use. And it will... oh, what's the term I'm using? It will fill your players with a little bit more fear, anxiety, to try to get these things to work, because they're the only things that can be used against certain objects or even structures. So you want to use these as much as possible and as quickly as possible. Now, I know what you're thinking. Drahjan, this is good for if you're fighting against one target, as it says in the ballista. However, there are going to be more than one creature attempting to attack a fortress at the same time. How do you suppose your players will defend against a horde of enemies? And you only have one target to choose from. Well, that's going to be a little bit more homebrewy and why this is a homebrew video. We're talking about swarms. Found in the Monster Manual on pages 337 to 339, and also there's another swarm, the Skeletal Swarm, on page 254 in Ghost of Saltmarsh. Now, the swarm ability goes as follows. The swarm can occupy another creature's space and vice versa, and the swarm can move through any opening large enough for a whatever the original singular creature was. The swarm can't regain hit points or gain temporary hit points. Now, going by the stats of these swarms, it seems that a swarm can consist of 7 or even 8 creatures. And since this is counted as one creature, it is one target. So you can use, say, a cannon against a swarm, and it would count as hitting one creature, but you're still get the feel of hitting multiple creatures. The Dungeon Coach actually went over a similar system that used swarm mechanics. Was Horde Combat? I can't remember what it was. I'll make sure to link that video in the description. The Dungeon Coach is actually pretty good. Now, let's go ahead and give you an example of a way you can use these swarm tactics against your players to make it slightly easier to fight an oncoming siege. For our example, we're going to go ahead and use the Commoner from the Monster Manual. Here are the normal stats that we have available to us. An AC of 10, only 4 hit points, subpar stats, and it's a CR of 0, and you also get a singular club attack. Now, for this example, we're going to call this swarm the Unruly Mob, based on the creature from Magic the Gathering, Unruly Mob. This is a large swarm of medium humanoids of any alignment. The AC is going to stay the same as it usually does with swarms. HP is going to be 36, which is 8 of the commoners. The strength did go up just a smidge, only to make a +1 modifier. And it did gain some condition immunities from Charmed, Frightened, Grappled, Paralyzed, Petrified, Prone, Restrained, and Stunned. You don't need to add these technically, but it makes sense to have them as part of the swarm concept. And it gets the swarm feature, of course. Now, the attacks I actually altered. Instead of multiple club attacks like it usually does for a swarm, I divided them to make it more like an angry mob. We have multi-attack. The mob makes 2 melee weapon attacks, one with their pitchforks and one with their torches. The torches is a slightly altered version of the club attack, where I do 10 bludgeoning damage with an additional 5 fire damage. And the pitchforks does 18 piercing damage. I did this because a angry mob would definitely have more than one type of weapon on hand. Usually the stereotypical pitchforks and torches. Well, I hope that explained to you what you could do with your sieges, my dear viewers. Like I said, the Horde of the Dragon Queen is one of the best examples of Horde mechanics that I have seen. Well, a siege mechanic. While it is meant for level 1 players, I would like to see what would happen for stronger players. And I would definitely use swarm mechanics for some of these interactions, some of these encounters. But that's for another day. I hope you enjoyed, my dear viewers. And for a final note, I am trying to rearrange my schedule to where I post videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Of course, one of them being one of my character conversions or character concepts. While I would appreciate it if you liked my videos, it's not entirely necessary. Nor is it necessary to subscribe like a lot of YouTubers ask you to do. If you want to, sure. I don't see any way it would help you view my videos. Usually when I click on a video, it ends up popping up a bunch of recommendations or even other recommendations for videos on my channel or whatever video I've clicked on. So the subscription and notification bell doesn't seem to be useful, but it might help you a little bit just in case you forget. But anyway, that's not important. Until next time, my dear viewers, I hope you enjoyed. This has been Drahjan, and I am offline.